Yeah, so I'm glad Richard told the story about me actually being a driver in my third job, because trying to follow a boy and his talk after the lunch hour, this is going to be, or he is, a very, very hard act to follow. So I'm a little intimidated to be up here on stage right now, especially after the previous speaker. What a remarkable and very personal message. So just to set the stage here, I probably don't have the same level of maybe a passion or intensity, or maybe even personal experience as Boy had before me. But I hope that what you'll find through my 20 minutes or so up here on stage is that I am equally passionate about certain things. I come from, at least in the last 15 years, a very traditional industry. AIG, it's an insurance company. I don't think you get more traditional than an insurance company in any environment. But I guess where, and I don't have the same sort of personal experiences that Boy had either. But what I do have is a passion for being part of an organization that has a larger contribution to the society or the communities in which we serve or which we operate in any country, but especially the Philippines, which has been my home for 12 of the last 15 years. But I also have a passion for being part of an organization. Certainly if I'm asked to lead or take a leadership role in an organization, one that has values, that we're not afraid to profess, and absolutely that we're not afraid to make sure all of us in the organization not just talk about and not just put on policies on the wall, but actually that we live and breathe every day. So we're not there yet, but hopefully what I can share with you through my discourse here is a little background about what we're doing in AIG, as well as some reflections on maybe the corporate world and how we take part in the discussion and the movement towards a greater diversity and inclusiveness in our workplace, and really what that means in terms of living those values. If you go on YouTube and put in diversity is strength, you'll see this video there, and it's interesting to see some of the comments. There's at this point thousands of comments that people have made in YouTube, but I'll broadly put them into three categories. Some people in the first category were openly supportive and encouraging, which I was very glad to see, and left various messages to say so. One comment which I recall was, I was a lesbian before, but even more so now. And if that's a statement about feeling comfortable and feeling free to profess who you are and your beliefs and your preferences, then I take that as a very strong, positive comment. But there are a number of comments along those lines. I think there are some who are equally excited about the video, but I'm not quite sure if they got the message, because the comments were more like, "That's a really cool jersey. Where do I get one?" And if you're familiar with the All Blacks, the All Blacks were famous for, they're all black. They never had anything else on their jersey previous to the AIG sponsorship. And now the fact that they have some colors on the jersey is a pretty big statement. So a number of comments were all about, where can I find this jersey? I really think that's cool. Again, if people see that as cool because it's professing an openness and embracing diversity and inclusiveness, that's a good thing. If it's a fashion statement, well, maybe we're missing the message a little bit. And then the third category, unfortunately, were people who were vocally cynical about the message and about AIG's support for our diversity and inclusiveness campaign, or even the idea that inclusiveness was worth championing in today's society or within the workplace of today's corporations in our society. So I won't necessarily repeat those comments, but I guess the cynicism and about sincerity, and some who just aren't welcoming to the idea of diversity, that differences in whatever form, whether it's race, gender, religion, sexual preference, that resistance is still very much alive, and you'll see that, unfortunately, from some of the comments that people leave publicly. So the reactions to our communications aren't unique, or probably not different than those experienced from from other organizations, ranging from the fundamental difference in values to misunderstanding of what those mean, to maybe an underappreciation for the value of diversity, or the real struggles that our employees and our colleagues face or experience because of those differences, or to difficulties in making real positive change happen, moving from the corporate video to really what's it really mean for me or you or our employees or our stakeholders who interact with our company. Yet these reactions also highlight the difficulty of really realizing a diverse and inclusive workplace across these many cultures. So at AIG and in the organizations that we have here, we've got 3 organizations in the Philippines, about 4,000 employees. As Richard mentioned, I lead 2 of those organizations. For the record, I only get 1 paycheck, but I do enjoy the diversity of different industries and teams that I work with on a day-to-day basis. But I'll talk a little about how we go or are going from defining values all the way to living those values. So in the first place, defining values, and this is merely a starting point. And I hope that we all realize that. And maybe to compare this with a starting point for me professionally. My first professional experience was in the U.S. military. I spent 10 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, starting in the late 80s and early 90s. So I don't want to undervalue the importance of defining values and making a statement of what your values are, or what your organizational values are, whether you're a government organization or a corporate or private sector organization. Because the Marine Corps of the 1980s, as much as I respected that organization, had so many positives in terms of defending many of the values which I and many of my countrymen held dear. It also was a very exclusive organization in many ways, and certainly for the LGBT community. It's come a long, long way in 30 years. But much of that had to start with, from the top down, defining what those values are and what it means to be inclusive, and going from a very exclusive organization to, in a U.S. context, don't ask, don't tell, to an organization today which is openly inclusive, at least in terms of its statements and where it's moving. It's been a remarkable journey over a 30-year period. Maybe in some ways that's too long, but again, considering the traditional and very hierarchical and maybe old school nature of that particular organization, it's been a very significant change. So the importance of defining those values, it's much more than a statement, company values, placard you put on the wall, or policies or HR policies that you send about, but it is at least a starting point. I think the more important one, at least as we look at AIG today, is that as we move towards living those values, is how do you champion those values? If you state your values and say this is where your organization is or where you want your organization to be, how do you take the next step forward and how do you make it a living value? Statements aren't enough. So the saying that talk is cheap certainly applies. For AIG, this is one of the powers that we have, or one of the powers that we see in the All Blacks sponsorship. So the message here in the video you just saw, that resonates a lot, particularly with our AIG employees. And in some ways, I think this video is more powerful internally than it is externally. It's powerful internally because we use the All Black sponsorship as as a representation of many of the values as well as the mission that we have as an insurance company, and the challenges we face. A global insurance company, taking large risks and making sure we're successful, even with very large positions and very large risks, much like the All Blacks have done within their sports franchise. That resonates within our employee base. So now to take another step further and tie this to some of our corporate values, and tying this to diversity and inclusiveness, that's a pretty directed statement, much more to maybe the emotional level of what the All Blacks mean to our employees and to our organization. And that's one way we're trying to resonate more than just the defining value statement, to really how do we bring this into the more day-to-day and the more emotional level. The other aspect of really I guess I would really say this is kind of the front lines for AIG in terms of moving towards living our values. And these come from our employee resource groups, or our ERGs. Real change, we know, has to come from within. And that comes when people truly understand the challenges of their colleagues, of their friends, of their coworkers, and they share a common purpose with them. I think if all of our 45,000 employees around the world could hear boys talk, or some of the talks that we've heard that our ERGs have brought into our organization to share these experiences, it would put a very different color and a very different tenor into the imperative and the urgency behind diversity and inclusiveness campaign and the meaning of those values. And that's one of the goals of our ERGs, to help really from the bottom up bring those experiences into our organization, not just for the members of those ERGs, but for the benefit of the organization at large. We've got about 45,000 employees around the world. Today, about 13,000 or almost 14,000 of our employees are part of these ERGs, about 105, 104 of them around the world today. And they represent a different facet of our employee demographics. It could be faith, color, ethnicity, certainly gender, sexual preference, age groups, special needs, and other backgrounds. Our goal is not necessarily to encourage one particular ERG or the other. Operating in 85 countries around the world, there are some there's some commonalities, but there's also some very different needs as well. And the ERGs are our vehicle to make sure that we have a local focus, but that's relevant for our local companies and employees, but also it's connected with our global messages and some of the more global challenges, such as discrimination based on gender or sexual preference. So these ERGs are headed by AIG employees, and they can be employees at any level. But generally, it's not the general manager or the CEO. We want every one of our employees to be empowered to say, there is a need or an opportunity to improve our organization, to be a more inclusive place, to be a more comfortable place, and more inviting place, and inviting home for employees of all backgrounds. We want employees to be empowered to be able to raise their hand, create a like-minded group, and then get funding and support from our organizations and really move this from the bottom up. So it's a complementary strategy with some of the top-down, defining our values and articulating those values really from the top down, but then more of a ground-up movement of our employees. And there's a couple of examples I can give you in terms of how these ERGs are integrated into our business. One is leading awareness education. And this comes from whether it's talks that they host, guest speakers that they invite in, or events that they invite into our organization. I've seen a couple of familiar faces today from around the industry, and I appreciate that whether you're a competitor or not, we have a common purpose, at least in terms of the topic here today. And some of you have come actually into AIG and shared your backgrounds and your experience with us and with our employees, and we've all benefited from that. But that was an initiative that's been led from our ERGs to have these sort of events, and which for me has been not just an event, but also it's been an education about what it means to live a life of discrimination or harassment or even violence, which luckily I can say I haven't had a personal experience like that, but I've learned tons from our ERG, so I can hopefully better relate. And I hope all of our managers and leaders can better relate because of what our ERGs do and because of the awareness, education, and the sharing of experiences. And that goes along with career development as well, whether it's learning how to network across different diversity groups or even creating our network organizations themselves. I think in today's at least in the media, we hear more about women in terms of how networks are either by design or just by history are more friendly towards male employees. There's male networks, whether it's the drinking, whether it's the after hours, whether it's the dinners, and how women have to create a separate type of networking or be more maybe aggressive or deliberate about how to create a network in order to really break through that glass ceiling. And that's one more example where we use our ERGs to help create different networks or maybe modify the networks that exist historically to be more inclusive for the future. And then, of course, there are brand ambassadors internally, as well as brand ambassadors externally as well, furthering our community work and outreach, whether it's partnerships with PFIP, the various chambers of commerce, Junior Achievement, Habitat for Humanity, a variety of partner organizations for our different D&I groups and our different ERGs. So between these groups, employees can make the difference in furthering our vision for a more inclusive workplace. And I'll give you a couple, other examples. I think I already mentioned some of the training and education, even a session in terms of the meaning of SOGI or SOGI, which was new to me, new to many of our employees. But if we didn't have our ERGs bringing this into our organization, then we would be outsiders, or even I would be an outsider in terms of how do I work with the leadership of our organization in terms of addressing some of the challenges and some of the barriers within that organization. Also, HIV awareness campaign, enhancements to our sexual harassment and gender harassment training, contributions to our company policies, our whistleblower policy to protect people who come forward and raise their hand, understanding the needs for domestic partner benefits, which I'm very excited to say that we've launched this year in 2018, an inclusion of domestic partner benefits, same-sex domestic partner benefits within our healthcare plan. But we couldn't have done that without the expertise and the firsthand learning and understanding and needs that come through these employee resource groups. And today, trying to better understand the needs and a strategy to address gender-neutral bathrooms. Those are just a couple examples of where our ERGs are support networks, but they're also advisory networks, and they also help create and shape and drive our company policies in the long term. So the ERGs, this is really the ground up approach for our inclusiveness campaign, or how we try to improve our environment within AIG. But ultimately, the values have to be understood, but also embraced, as well as the rationale for those values believed by all. Otherwise, they will just remain placards on the wall or statements in a PR campaign or in a corporate video. And I think this touches upon the cynicism that I see in some of the messages in the case of the video and the YouTube comments. The cynicism that is this lip service because there's a social awareness or a CSR campaign or a rationale, or is this something that we as a corporation, we as an organization truly believe in and support? And I think and for me at least, that's where it comes to the statement that diversity equals talent. And I'll leave you maybe with a couple thoughts in terms of the imperative that I see as a leader in an organization around diversity equaling talent. So one is, and I think this has been remarked on quite a bit about the value and importance of diversity, in terms of creating a larger talent base and a more wider access to a talent base that is just tremendous and generally underappreciated in many cases in terms of the capabilities that a diverse workforce brings. That's one aspect of the message about diversity equals talent. But I think what becomes more personal for me is in terms of what does that mean for leadership and the respect and that goes within an organization when you have a continuity of values and beliefs between leaders and our staff and all of our employees in the organization. Because if I, as a leader, or any of our leaders, if we're just seen as just being, giving lip service to the messages about inclusiveness, then what does that say about us? It means that we as leaders are hypocrites. And I firmly believe that people don't leave organizations because of bad organizations. They generally leave organizations because of bad leaders. And leaders that either don't make decisions or are hypocritical in their decisions are probably the worst of the breed. So the importance of supporting diversity, but more importantly, talking the talk, saying what we believe in, being proud and being willing to say what we believe in, but then also putting muscle behind that. That to me is where you have to walk the walk. And a couple other, maybe just examples to put some meat behind that. In the video there, one of the closing comments said that this is a fight against or a challenge that's deeply devious. And I think the deeply devious part of it is that you don't really know. In some cases, it's very overt. But in many cases, it's not. And I'm talking about discrimination or resistance to a value which promotes inclusiveness for all backgrounds in an organization. And I'll think about a couple of the statements that I have heard and still do hear. How many times have I been told by a hiring manager that they need to hire somebody who's young and energetic? How many times have I heard that we need to hire a single woman because they don't want to deal with the distractions of a parent? And ironically, I hear at the same time, well, I want to hire a mother because they work harder. They have something really at risk and they're a harder worker. I'm not sure which one is well, I don't think either one is accurate, but I hear both sides. Or I need to hire a man or hire a woman for various reasons. It actually concerns me that most of the either overt or apparently what may seem fairly minor statements of that run contrary to our values actually have to do more with sexual harassment or are inclusive of women in our workforce. But what I don't hear as much is about the LGBT community, and that actually concerns me more, because what I don't know I can't address, or what we don't see is more deeply devious. And then we don't really know how do we really bring that out to the forefront so we can deal with it and hopefully change it for our culture and for our organization. A couple years ago, I've had the pleasure of working here in the Philippines for 12 out of my last 15 years. So it means that some of the team leaders I had over a decade ago are some of our senior managers in the organization here today. And that comes with some pretty close personal relationships, which I've really enjoyed. But a couple years ago, we were on an offsite, and we were remarking about a somewhat divisive incident, 5-6 years in the past, where there's one of our leaders was involved with a harassment case, in this case a sexual harassment case, and I thought it was dealt with. I thought it was dealt with quickly and appropriately. I thought it was more of an issue of ignorance than of values. But years later, we're on the offsite, we're more relaxed moment, and I hear some of my leaders talking, and they said, yeah, that guy, he was the biggest womanizer in the whole bunch. He was always hitting on the women. He was always doing this. And I was shocked. I was shocked partially because I didn't see it, but also shocked because they were talking about it openly, like, oh yeah, everybody knew that, but not a single person came forward and said, hey, that's not leadership. That's not the values that we espouse in our organization. That's not the sort of inclusive environment that we want in our organization. And I think that the team I have is a world-class team, both in terms of professional, technical skills, and also the values that they lead. But it was just this blinder that was on in terms of this particular case, because they just seen it across their society, their community, across the media, whatever it was, they were just used to it in that particular context. It didn't strike them as being something that was inappropriate, that was contrary to our values, or something that they as leaders in an organization had a moral obligation to step forward and say, this is not the way that we become and we promote an inclusive environment. And the last point that shocked me was because, I didn't know about it until years later. All right? And it was on an offsite, drinking a couple beers, hearing about it then. But I take this back then to my opening statement, that I may not come up here with the same anger as my predecessor had in his speech today, but I hope I come up here with a great deal of excitement and passion to make sure that I don't hear again in any organization that I'm connected with that, oh yeah, this was going on and we didn't feel a moral obligation to correct it or to improve it or to be better. Because if we don't, then we will never truly live our values. So thank you very much for having me today. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little about AIG's story, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.